see. Okay, I should be live, but I don't think. Oh, okay. There we go. Okay, what's up, folks? As some of you know, this is my first live broadcast without the help of the engineer I have on my radio show. So this is new to me. As you can see, my setup is basically my home office. So um, I got quite a bit to learn on this. So if you can't hear me, if you can't see me, please let me know. I appreciate it. Good looking out, BGS. Enrich and Bill Bonger, how you doing? Good to see people in here. Pops, what's up? Universal Mike, Darker Visions Media, Art, good to see you, brother. Shout outs to Darker Visions, NJ Progressive, Ebony Knight. You guys came in early. Mr. Meach. Not going to hold on to y'all too long. What I'm contemplating as far as my format, because I still have a lot to learn on lighting and all kinds of other jazz. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to broadcast every Wednesday. I'm either going to do my first and third Wednesdays of the month will be on Inner Light. And for those of you who've watched me before or listened to me before, you know that I'll do Inner Light Radio, and then I'll post the program to YouTube later. But on the second and fourth Wednesdays, I'll just do it live like this. And that's because I'm still getting my footing. There's still a lot that I need to learn, but also just to maintain some consistency. So pretty much every Wednesday at 5 o'clock Pacific time, you guys should be hearing from me. All right. See people still coming in. Cool. Now, my format is just going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to do about an hour and just kind of get some things out. I'm not holding super fast to that tonight because I'm rushing back here. You can see I started at 6:30. I planned to start earlier, but I had to run to a dentist appointment. So this is the earliest I could get it in tonight. But as you guys can tell, the title of the show is The Manufacturing of Black Male Intra-Racial Subservience, or in other words, submissive Black males. And this is something that I want to generate some dialogue on because it's really, I think it's really essential for us to understand gender formation, particularly in the Black community, because I think there are things that are happening with it and have been happening with it for several decades that doesn't always get a lot of attention. Okay, so I think there are areas where Black men are starting to have some dialogues, but we're doing so several decades after the formation of a formal kind of feminism for women. And that's left men without a whole lot of direction, right? Black to Death, much appreciation to you. Mad Gorilla. Also, if you guys get a chance, go ahead and I'll post the. Hold on, see, I should have had this ready. I apologize. These are the kind of kinks I'm learning about as I go. Just how to have certain information ready to go and whatnot. So bear with me one moment, and I will post some stuff in the right sections. There you go. All right, so I can go ahead and post that in the chat. So please go ahead and support, and we can get it going. So anyway, what I was saying is that Black men have not really had a formal gender formation. And one of the things that I've noticed since the 1970s onward is that Black male-only spaces have been encroached upon. I had a friend of mine ask me yesterday how she could identify some, primarily Black male spaces. And I told her in the last few years, you're not going to find very many. Male spaces in general in the West have been problematized and listed as inherently sexist, inherently misogynist. And so you've seen this kind of assault on male-only spaces, not necessarily female-only spaces, but primarily male. So the barbershop would be one space where black men could congregate, but half the ones I'm at now are salons as well. So there's a split there, you know. In the 90s and the 80s, much of the time, we would actually have to articulate our views through certain comedians, through certain entertainers, singers, rappers who may articulate some ideas about black manhood. But those were always filtered through very particular people. So you could watch Eddie Murphy Raw, right? That was probably one of the first major places, along with Richard Pryor, where I heard black men talking about the impact of divorce, right? Those were the kind of spaces you had to filter through until you got to the 2000s. Um, you know, I see you, Black to Death. He said the last male space is the cigar bar, right? But that's kind of the problem. So it's not until the 2000s that you start to see black men really engaging on social media and comparing notes geographically, right? You know, comparing notes across the country, and now we're comparing notes, you know, in terms of an continental kind of discourse where we're finding out that the status of black males and the way they're being treated tends to, you know, be at the fairly low end of the spectrum. Now, my primary focus is, you know, African American black males, but at the end of the day, some of the issues that we're talking about are definitely going to bleed over because of the perception of black manhood as a whole. So, I wanted to start with this question of submissive black males and what I mean by that. I'm not talking about weak-willed black males. I'm not talking about black males that are, you know, somehow less masculine. It's nothing of that sort. Um, right. And I see you, NJ Prophet. Boy Scouts are no longer Boy Scouts. That's definitely true. I had my son in Boy Scouts, and you know, it's definitely not the same dynamic. So these kind of spaces have been encroached upon. But in terms of submissiveness, what I'm basically saying is that I'm looking more at the status of black men in society and not so much their internal temperament. And I think that's an important distinction to make because it really does help us explain why so many of us as a collective are in very similar situations, right? So when I talk about, you know, submissive meaning vulnerable, submissive meaning servile to other groups interests and not necessarily self-focused, but that's a conditioned response based on how black men are socialized and the position they're in society. So by that, you know, there are some little things that hit there and here and again, trying to master looking at the chat from time to time. I appreciate you guys coming through. Chief in the South, what's up? BK Hammer, Joe from DC. But anyway, so with that, there are little things here and there that I think kind of help us frame that. So first of which, I'm going to do a little screen share. Hopefully I don't mess that up. Let me see. Can you guys, I'm trying to see if you guys can see it. And yet it's not. There we go. Hold on. All right. I'm almost there. Bear with me here. All right. Okay. So I think I need to pull that out because I'm not sure if you guys can see it. All right. I apologize. This is all coming to me a little slow. All right. So I'm trying to get this, should say the Mercury News on the screen. So let me know when you guys can see that. Okay. It's showing the whole screen. Okay. So let's do this differently. Okay. Let's try that again. Okay. So let's just go with the entire screen and I will switch this over to that. That's confusing as hell. There we go. There we go. I apologize. All right. So if you can see this article here, Mercury News, this is dated 2017. 75% of Black California boys don't meet state reading standards, right? Now, again, I'm just going to hit some random information, but it hopefully will give us a framework for how to understand the status of Black males, Black boys, right? So if you look at this, we're seeing that boys, particularly in California, and I think this is probably reflective on one level or another on the national scale, but at the end of the day, you have this dynamic happening with boys. Now, I am a Cal State University professor, right? I'm an associate professor at Fresno State in Africana Studies. And one of the things I found by going to a workshop in Bakersfield a couple of years ago was something that I had never been told, didn't know about. But in the California State University system, by the end of or really by the first year, 70% of Black males drop out. Right, 70% of Black males across California in the California State University system drop out. So in one sense, in the K through 12 dynamic, you have 75% of Black boys who don't meet the state reading standards. And then at the college level, of the select few that are able to go, 70% of them drop out within the first year. This is the dynamic that we're in. This is what we're looking at right now. Right, this is how we're seeing the status of Black boys, right? So we're behind in many contexts educationally. We're not necessarily trained for leadership, and in that way, we as Black males find ourselves already out of the gate in a somewhat servile position in terms of not being in a position to offer more, right? There are 5 areas, really 6 actually, that I want to bring to this discussion to right about now. In the 1970s, sociologist Robert Staples argued that there were 2 primary institutions in the Black community. He argued for the family and the church. And the argument he made was that in neither, in the 1970s, were Black men in a position of authority, not as a collective. Of course, we have in the last 50 years, a little bit longer, Black men in many ways transitioning to Islam. But even within the Christian church framework, you have pastors and deacons, but for the most part, the church is overwhelmingly female, right? As a matter of fact, I found another piece that gave us a good framework for the percentage of men in the church. And I thought it would be interesting for you all to see. Now that I'm getting a little more savvy at this, I think I can do it a little more smoothly. There we go. So I'm getting better, y'all. So this is an article from Pew Research. Black men are less religious than Black women, but more religious than white women and men. And one of the things it points out in the piece is that in terms of attending religious services weekly, Black men do so at about 40%. Black women is the bar right underneath at 52. And it measures other things such as, how important religion is, how often people pray, so on and so forth. But according to the results of this, we can see that Black males are not as participatory as Black females, but at higher rates than other groups. And it's interesting that this is the same dynamic we see when it comes to voting, as a matter of fact, or particularly voting Democrat. But anyway, I digress. What I'm trying to say here is that in the institutions that Staples points out, he talks about, he talks about the 2 primary institutions that he identifies in the Black community, the church and the family. Dr. Kevin Cosby, however, adds several more. He adds education, he adds business, politics, and media. So if we look at these 6 categories to determine Black male status in the community, we can test them to actually see what position Black males are in. So we just talked about the church, and we know in terms of the church, Black men are participatory to lesser degrees than Black women. Although I think there's still some research to be said about alternative religious practices, but for the sake of the moment, we'll just talk about, their percentage according to the Pew article. So not in a position of authority, despite that you have individual males in a position of authority, but not males as a collective. In terms of education, Now, this one's interesting. Matter of fact, I'm going to make that one last because I have a few things I want you to see in terms of that. So we'll come back to education. Even in the 1970s, Staples pointed out that black males were active in leading families, so to speak, at a lesser rate. Now we know that percentage is between 70 and 80% at this point in terms of children born to single parent households. So that meaning in and of itself that black males are not in a position of authority, so to speak, in regard to the family. In terms of business, well, we know that 99% of black female owned businesses have one employee, yet black women are designated the group with the largest number of businesses started, particularly in recent years. So in terms of number of businesses, you don't find black males in a position of authority. Political representation. I have a piece that I wrote. I believe it is posted on my Twitter account, and it's a posted tweet, so you can find it there pretty easily. But it deals with the argument against black male privilege. And in that piece, one of the things I talk about is the current status of the black electoral figure, right? And what we find is that black males are behind in terms of that. Black females are outpacing black males in terms of political participation and electoral status, in terms of the positions they're moving into. Now, why is this important? It again highlights that in regard to politics, at least the percentage of which that black folk in this country are representative of, black males are not necessarily in a position of authority. And that in and of itself is also based on education, which we haven't gotten to yet. And then last but not least, media, right? Media is definitely an area that we're seeing micromedia being able to form in terms of what we're doing here and others. But in terms of actually, any large scale media companies, I don't care if you're talking about publishing companies or television, you're not finding black males in severe positions of authority. So what we're looking at between Robert Staples and Dr. Kevin Cosby is an assessment that lets us know that in each of the areas, whether it's in the 1970s to the last few years, how these areas and institutions have been designated in the black community, black males are not in a position of authority. If anything, they're being prepared for a position of subservience in terms of that. Now let's get to education. Now, the reason I held off on education is because I wanted to share a slide with you and I thought you might find interesting. I'm trying to see how to. Okay, so this one is going to have to take the entire screen. Okay. So I hope you guys can see that. I think you can. All right. So basically what we're looking at here are the number of degrees conferred from 1976 to 2017. And what you find is, if you look through the chart, I added, this is an updated one. I updated this one, I think, last week from the one I had previous, and I added certificates to it. So that bolstered the numbers a little bit. And then, of course, the additional year of data according to the NCES. So National Center for Educational Studies puts forth this information every year, and I kind of just do this chart. Now, this chart is not designed to suggest the relationship between, the number of black graduates and white graduates to demonstrate, proficiency. It's just designed to show you the raw number of degrees. And you can actually break this up, look at it in terms of race, you can look at it in terms of gender, and you can see the number of degrees conferred across the board. Now, what's interesting for black males is that at every level, from certificate to associate's degree to bachelor's to master's, there is no point where you see a superior number of men to women, right? Now, you see that in the white community, that dynamic holds true as well, except at the doctoral level, and that's more than likely due to family production and so on and so forth. But in terms of the black community, it's not the same. So we are roughly at half the number of degrees that black women have from certificates to doctoral level. Now, the problem with that, however, is that within the academy, especially in liberal arts, the argument is that black men dominate the discussion and are responsible for a great deal of misogyny, which is interesting because we're barely there, numerically speaking. We are a fraction of a fraction. So what we're looking at there is that Black men are not in the kind of position that we're told we're in. And so that said, and yes, Black to Death, I agree, that definitely speaks to disposability. What each of these situations does is it creates a context where Black males find themselves in a dependent position because they are socialized. And by socialized, I don't just mean culturally, I mean by policy, positioned in a lesser state. Now, one can say in terms of income, Black men, tend to make more than Black women, but that's when you don't control for incarceration, right? So the populations they're using are fairly small, even though that population of working Black males tends to earn a little more. And that also has to do with occupations and so on and so forth. But again, when you control for incarceration, it's a different dynamic. There's about 1/10 of the total Black male population, if I'm not mistaken, that's incarcerated at a time. And what people don't want to talk about is how incarceration ends up being kind of a scarlet letter. So it is a permanent state of affairs almost when you come out of prison, especially if you don't have a high school diploma. The statistics go up dramatically in terms of how many of those Black men who went into prison without a high school diploma remain at the minimum wage level outside of prison for the rest of their lives. And that's not even dealing with recidivism. People are going back to prison because they have no other way to survive, right? That scarlet letter keeps them from participating. So a large percentage of Black males, relatively speaking, are struggling with this. So in each of these areas, again, from business to family to education to church to media, we're finding Black males who are being conditioned into a position where we are not able to stand in a position of authority with any great consistency, right? And so when I think we look at these kind of dynamics, what it forces us to do is examine what that kind of long-term treatment produces. Now, this is okay, I'm going to do this again. Okay. So my little cheat sheet over here. Yeah, so you can see it. So this is normally one of the things I show in my class when I talk about what actually happened. Now, we can go back much further. This is something that BGS and I have talked about. This is something that when I interviewed Jelaba Baba, we talked about Ronald Neal. We looked at the ways by which Black men have experienced subservience earlier than the 1970s. Going back to slavery, there are different levels of it. But for now, we're going to talk about really the late 60s onward and look at the impact. So as you can see from this particular screenshot I have, this is one of the PowerPoints that I use in my Black male class. When I explain the policies that directly impacted Black men, I keep a short list just to give us bullet points to start with, right? And so we start with the draft. We start with the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the impact that had on Black male presence, particularly in families. One of the things that we find is that, one of the dramatic shifts that took place during and after the wars was, of course, the, number of Black men that died, number of Black men that came back with some degree of shell shock, PTSD, but also, and drug use, in terms of what was going on there, but also in terms of how it impacted families. It meant that there was an early shift toward female-led households because men were physically not present, right? I talk about birth control a lot. And the reason I talk about birth control a lot is because this is a dramatic moment where technology severely impacts the Black community in a way that gives the power of family production primarily to women and men on the outside. And women are able to kind of manage their own biological context a little more so, whereas men, even to this day, are still using items that we've had since the 1950s. I mean, we're mainly talking about condoms. We're talking about vasectomies and, the pull-out method or abstinence. I mean, it's really ridiculous in a particular sense. But that shift, that technological input that changed the dynamic of family production in the Black community, and many communities, but as it pertains to the Black community, had a severe impact on Black men, where, what may have been agreed upon to be just a sexual experience becomes a lifelong obligation that they have no say in. Because part and parcel to the birth control issue is also my body, my choice. So that, further left men in a position of being subject to women. Now, hold on, I'm gonna check something real quick. Okay. All right. What's up, people? Um, Thank you, BGS, for shouting people out as they came in. I'm not really fluid with this yet, so I appreciate that, man. All right. So moving on, we saw men, for the most part, due to the man in the house rule, blocked from Section 8, WIC, TANF, child support for several decades, long enough for it to become commonly understood that these resources should not be earmarked for men. So again, coming back from war, often being subject to new birth control practices, and being locked out of extreme, the kind of resources that people in extreme need are supposed to be able to tap into, Black men find themselves blocked out of. And then, especially if we're talking about the 70s, we haven't even hit deindustrialization yet, right? Where most of the jobs that Black men are working go overseas. Now, those that would increasingly go to college, one of the critiques I hear from everyday people is that we tend to go into fields that aren't practical, that aren't useful. And actually, the data shows us quite the opposite. If you go to the same links that you saw on the last slide I had up for the NCES, what you find is on every level up from, I think it's associates to bachelors, Black men primarily focus on business as a field. That's the largest field they go into. And we're often underfunded. We often come from poverty. Many of us don't have even an inheritance, let alone any wealth. But nonetheless, we tend to go into business as the largest field. Black women, business, but that's right underneath health. So they're able to go into healthcare a little more often, or education. Black males tend to focus on business, education, so on and so forth. It's at the master's and doctorate level that you see them primarily going into two fields, either going into medicine or law, right? So Black men are actually participating and using college when they go, and they're able to finish using it very practically. But the biggest problem that impacts us in terms of education is K through 12, right? The K through 12 system is such where the overwhelming majority of teachers are women, mostly white. 76% of the teachers are women altogether. It's only about 6.5% that's Black, and only 2% of that are male. So there is research that suggests that the gender of the teacher plays into and how it impacts the learning of the students. And some studies show that girls tend to do better under female teachers and boys tend to do better under male teachers. Well, what does that mean in a system that is over 75% female? How does that impact the boys? Well, we're seeing boys dropping out across race, but this adversely impacts Black men, right? Looking at the fifth bullet, the war on drugs, right? The war on drugs has its roots in the 60s, as we can see with, well, I don't have it. I didn't post the article with me today, but what we started to notice is that Nixon's cabinet basically identified Black people and what he called hippies as the two primary groups he wanted to focus on. So that said, what we see happening is, an overwhelmingly specific target on Black men. So these Black men, many of whom came back from war, were introduced to a whole new birth control process that impacted them, but was new at the time. They found themselves blocked from welfare services, lost jobs on a tremendous level, and then the war on drugs hit at a time when that might have been the only income for a lot of people across the board. So these things actually compound on one another, right? And the result of the war on drugs, of course, is increased incarceration, up at higher levels of homicide, so on and so forth. So you can see in some of these that I posted up there, that creates a whole new kind of situation that positions us structurally below any other demographic, particularly within the Black community. So based on that kind of structured subservience, that structured deferment to a lesser position, you can see how the issues that impact Black men, especially in relation to the family, are not necessarily limited to how things go between two intimate, mother and father and the family dynamic, husband, wife, so on. It's not just about the position of Black men in intimate relationships or in the family. It's how that is all reinforced structurally in society. And these things, interdepend on one another. And so because they're able to, it has a profound impact on the Black male experience, the identification of what it means to be Black male, setting up meanings for that. All of that becomes directly impacted by our position in society. So if we're having trouble just being able to enter as children, and there's research that also shows that boys, and for example, are perceived to be older than they are starting at the age of about 4 or 5. So you're seeing a process that undermines Black boys, Black males of all ages from childhood on. And so I want to add that to the discussion, because when we look at the position of males, long before we even get to a situation where we're talking about intimate pair bonding or anything of that nature, the position in and of itself is one that is structurally diminished, and very purposefully so, which takes us into, Jim Sedanius's work, for those of you who are familiar with his book, Social Dominance Theory. And he talks about the subordinate male target hypothesis. And basically what he's saying to us is that, for any group that is systemically dominated by another, the males tend to be the target. And in regard to Black males being forcibly brought over here for enslavement, that process hasn't changed. That perception of Black males as a subordinate male group, an out group, in and of itself, Black males are targeted for that. And that is one of the things that he points out is the reason for, what we're experiencing now. Right. So with that in place, by the time we do start to talk about, what it actually means to be, what I mean by submissive or subservient, I'm talking about being in a deferred position of lack, a position placed underneath. And we are the only population of men that experience this, in contrast to our women, in that manner. And so I think it's important, because that sets the frame for family building, for community building, so on and so forth. That forced structural positioning as less than. And so you find individual males that are able to slip through the cracks at various points in time, but the collective is identified in a very problematic way. And this in and of itself requires us to have a very kind of nuanced discussion, about what that means. Now, the last time I did a show on here, a live show, we had a discussion on Star Wars. And I think we were talking about Star Wars as well as Watchmen. And the reason for that goes into one of the 6 areas identified by Staples and Cosby as media, right? It's not just about what companies Black males control, which is a very small number. It also has to do with what kind of imagery has been put out there. And the kind of imagery that we're seeing most of in regard to Black males is still negative, still highly problematic, but often one where the kind of heroism, that we see in the hero's story that's popular in a lot of films is often, denied to Black males in a particular way. I mean, even in 2019, much of even the superhero flicks we watch, Black men are in a position of service, right? They're still, these are characters that come out of the comics, but even in the comics, they were written as sideshows. They were written as, the hero's partners. The term escapes me at the moment, but you guys know what I mean. Black males, even in the comics, and as those comics are even now transitioning into film, are still being positioned as less than. So with that in mind, we're seeing even media reinforce the same kind of ideas. And so we have to actually have some very new conversations about how to address this and what position we want to see ourselves in, and be able to do so in a very targeted manner. Because the kind of, the type of subservience, I should say, that I'm pointing to with Black males, the reason I keep going back to that is when I hear even men themselves talk about what it means to be, how do I put it? How do I want to say that? When I look at Black males who aspire to represent a kind of strength, that we associate with masculinity, and even when they're able to do so, that strength can manifest in earnings and how well they're able to take care of their family, personal confidence and wherewithal and capability, how they carry themselves, how they dress, how they speak, how they navigate, how they conduct business, even if they're entrepreneurs. All of these definitions of strength that we have for men who are trying to be more and more capable. One of the difficulties we run up against is, of course, other people's perceptions and their assumptions about Black males, but also this kind of systemic wall that I'm talking about, right? Where we're starting with less, usually no capital, so on and so forth. Those kind of dynamics change the discussion. And that's what I'm really kind of wanting to highlight here. You can be strong, you can be a quote unquote alpha male, you can be all of those things, but Black males as a category still find themselves subject to this structural lack. And those are kind of some of the issues that we need to be able to address in a very forthright manner. Let me bounce through here a little bit, do some catching up. Let's see. I see enriching Billmonger adds a point in there. Cultural reform is one aspect. Culture is definitely important, but I'm talking about structural issues, right? So we have to actually figure out what we want to do and how much of that we want to identify and how specific we want to be. If we're talking about politics, do we want to be in a position where we have an outlined plan of what it is that serves Black men's interests? For example, is there anybody else that might be talking about, family court reform? That might not be in the Black community. I don't know any other demographic other than Black men that might find that important, but that might be something we would want to target, right? Let's see. Trying to go through these a little bit. Let's see. Thank you, BGS. Okay, Black Uru Strikes poses a relevant question, right? How do we change this if the state default is to give dominion over our children to the mothers? That would definitely be one of those kind of reasons to seriously advocate for family court reform and actually be able to articulate that as an interest. Now, at this point, I'm not talking about what is feasible and what can be done tomorrow. I'm just talking about, is there an agenda? Is there a discussion that we can have about, and this is something I'll be introducing over the next month, but in every area of relevant life for Black men, do we have a targeted set of interests that we've outlined and identified? And that goes from politics to religion. You know what I mean? Are we able to have that discussion? Because for the most part, Black males have not been heard on this to the degree we need to be for quite a while. That's actually something we need to talk about, right? We need to actually be able to sit down and identify what that focus should be. And not to the degree where everybody has to share the same opinion, but can we get on the same page about at least identifying what it is that Black males are in need of, what it is they're planning to do, and target across a series of different areas, not just limited to one. Okay, let me see here. So we got brothers pushing for internationality, international presence. Okay. Let's see, I'm trying to move this thing over. Okay. So I misplaced it. Dang, where did it go? There was another chart I had up that I think I've completely misplaced. Yeah. All right. That means that I'll find it 5 minutes after we end. It's usually how this kind of goes. Okay. So I think somebody posed the question of how we exactly do this in relation to how much state access, our women tend to have. And I think I've posted this before, but just in case I haven't, this is according to an article written by Collier Meyerson, How Our Racist Child Support Laws Hurt Poor Black Fathers the Most. In the article, one of the things he points out is that over 115 billion is owed to the government in terms of child support, but 70% of that is owed by Americans who make less than $10,000 a year. And so when you find yourself in this position, right, and we see the impact that has, one of the difficulties is being able to address that while being a part of the poorest population, right? We're most subject to this. So again, that goes to the agenda as well. If we're talking about how child support can structurally be used to hamper Black men, then I'm saying that we need to actually develop a platform where we're able to strategize how to deal with that as a collective. We've not really identified in the last several decades as a collective of men in many ways, because much of how we've been socialized is to serve others, right? Especially in the community, serve our women, serve our children. Black men from childhood, especially in the last 4 decades, who were primarily raised by women, have been socialized to prioritize women, prioritize their interests, prioritize their experiences, and of course, we prioritize family. The research shows that Black male fathers tend to be the most participatory, so we're doing that. The problem we have in all of this prioritizing is we've not really learned how to prioritize Black males. And I've showed you the stats regarding children, Black male children in K through 12. There's definitely a need for it at every age. As a matter of fact, this is something that I show my students. Okay, so I think I can share this. Nope. Okay, it's not coming up. All right, so I got to do this again, entire screen. All right. So if you can see this chart, you'll notice that this is a chart dealing with 10 leading causes of death for Black males, 1999 to 2017, right? And you'll notice that below the age of 1, meaning prior to birth even, the numbers for the various issues that impact death are much higher for Black boys. Much higher for Black boys. The only other group find similar numbers are Native Americans, depending on the chart you're looking at, for the most part. But short of that, African Americans, so you can see here, the short gestation issues, over 18,000 deaths, congenital anomalies, almost 10,000, SIDS, maternal pregnancy complications, right? But again, if this was just a Black issue, we would just be looking at that. But we can actually see that, yeah, here we go. So this is the chart for Black females, same time period, 1999, 2017, top 10 causes of death. You'll find, if you go back and compare the charts, that the numbers are lower. So what I'm saying is, even in regard to us being in the womb, Black males have a different experience, right? Depending on what platform you want to look at, we find that consistently to be the case with Black males. So there needs to be a concerted agenda that primarily targets Black males, not only in terms of resources, but in terms of strategy. And I'm talking about Black males themselves, right? This has got to finally be a conversation that we have regarding our experience and our lives. And that's not to say that no other aspect is important. No other demographic in the community is important. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying Black males at some point have to be able to actually dialogue about our own experience and not defer to others, particularly out of any type of shaming or guilting or any of that. Prioritizing the Black male experience by having Black males themselves lead that discussion. It's the time to do that. Right, the availability of information in the last several decades is off the chain. So we should be able to do this across occupation, across class, and that's one of the things that I want to do with this program. I want to bring brothers together across all those dynamics. Now, the next few guests that I'll be interviewing on my radio show will be academics, but you'll see I'm going to try and mix a little bit of that over time, because I really think there needs to be a discourse that takes place that doesn't defer to others' interests and allows for us to ask what are our interests. I talked about this in terms of relationships, and I mentioned this in a couple of different shows. My students, when I ask them the question about relationships, I ask them how many have met women who are very outlined in terms of what they're looking for, what their priorities are, what their interests are, what they demand out of a relationship. Every single man said he'd met more than a few, but dated more than one as well. When I asked the question how many males had a list, not one raised their hand. And I've done this in several classes over the last few years. Not one. I have not run across a black male that had a list of priorities, desires, interests, requirements for a relationship. That same dynamic, I'm saying, is happening across a lot of different spectrums. Have we outlined what a black male political agenda would look like? Social agenda, religious agenda, so on and so forth. There are ways that I think we need to do that, and we got to develop that discussion. It's time to definitely do it, but now with the availability of information that we have, it's imperative. Bearborn says I have 3 lists. Beautiful. Okay. I'm still, this is not, it's kind of, this might be my mouse or something. This thing is barely moving. Right. Okay. Shout out to Scott Peterson. Good to see you again, brother. So what I'd like to do is, the other reason I wanted to move to this format with StreamYard is I definitely wanted to be able to chat and have more of a discourse and bring people on. And so I'll be doing a little more of that. But I definitely want to have this discussion because I think it's time to push an interest that we haven't really learned how to do before. And that's the imperative part. We have not really been socialized to actually, kind of do that. We've been socialized to serve. So, one of the things I heard as a little kid, and I still meet kids who hear all the time, is you're the man of the house, at 7, at 8, you know what I mean? And what that ends up doing is it gives you the definition of man as one that is in service to whatever the family needs. And I'm not saying that that's in and of itself, the problem. I'm simply saying that because that's how many of us are introduced to manhood, we don't learn how to prioritize our own experiences and actually be able to have not only dialogues with other black men or men in general, but even dialogues within ourselves. It's not until in their 40s and 50s that I meet black men that are able to describe how their upbringing shaped their perspective, how they were taught to deprioritize themselves, whether they, the traditional kind of MRA terms like serve as unpaid bodyguards or things of that nature. Those things are relevant. But that's the primary way we're introduced to manhood. It is in service to others. But the other aspect of it, in terms of it in and of itself, we don't learn how to do. And I think that's something that we have to, kind of teach ourselves how to do. What's up, Crimson Cure? Good to see you in here. Yeah. All right. So for life, let me see. For life, one, deep one. Yeah, black men been taught that they must please black women and meet their standards. Black women are not taught that. They believe they don't have to meet black men's standards. They'll shame men. Definitely. There's definitely that. But it goes back to the structural exclusion I've been talking about, the subservience, the trained subservience that black males are given intra-racially, like within the black community. The reason that impacts everything else is, the perception is that since you're there to serve, that's really all you're good for, in a very particular way. It's never stated outright like that, but black men can tell you their experiences, and I've been hearing it for years, where they're starting to feel like workhorses. They're starting to feel like beasts of burdens, like tools to be used and exchanged, right? And that feeling of that, I suspect, has been around for generations, but there hasn't been the same type of dialogue that we're able to have in the last 10 to 15 years that helps bring that out a bit. I don't know if this one is a little behind. I like this one here. And that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point, Bill Monger. We have been trained to adapt. We have not been trained to prioritize our interests. And that's not to suggest that all women would be opposed to you being interested in whatever your requirements were. It's simply to suggest that most Black men can't articulate one. And I think Bill Monger's point about adaptation being our primary, mode of training, I think that's very exact. Right? We learn how to adapt to whatever we run into, but that's a very different thing than actually articulating an agenda and a plan. Right? Captain Cisco, I'm definitely digging that name and the picture. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of come at you and give you a little bit of information just to kind of frame an ongoing discussion, which is really about where Black men find themselves, how we got here, and what it actually means. So again, moving beyond these kind of models about, alphas and betas, and really looking at on a larger structural level, this is where we find ourselves. And as long as we keep having these discussions as Black issues, when they often are Black male issues, we're going to continue to miss the bar. We're going to continue to miss the mark on addressing strategies that help. At some point, Black men need to be able to prioritize their own interests. Now, women have been socialized to do this for some time. Black women in particular, since the 60s and, second wave and third wave feminist movements, they've learned to prioritize their interests. They've learned to identify and actually even be able to support one another, serve as resources for one another. The way many Black males have been socialized, it's in a framework of competition, something that Dr. Ronald Neal pointed out in our last discussion last week on the Inner Light show, the Onyx report on innerlightradio.com, I should say. One of the things he pointed out is that Black men are brought up in a framework of competition, but that competition is not given proper boundaries, right? So we compete with the world, but we don't really consolidate our resources and function as a unit. And I'm saying I think it's time to do that. One of the reasons that we haven't been able to is we've really not had any type of significant men's movement in recent years that has been a space for that to be framed. That's happened since in the 2000s, but I'm saying over the last 4 to 5 decades, that's not something we were in a position to do. And there were resources extended, to feminist movements that men never got in that same way. And it's 2019, and you can't get a degree on Black male studies unless you go find Tommy Curry in Scotland, right? But you can get a degree on, women, on Black women, on Asian women, Latino women. Like you can get degrees in those, they're depending on where you go. And if nothing else, you can get a generic women's studies degree. But in terms of actually being able to be specific to Black males in the academy, you can't. Now, why am I saying that? Basically, all I'm saying is there's a substantive support base for the last few decades of feminism, but we haven't seen that for men. And so men are having to do it themselves. And what I'm hoping we can do is engender a discourse around the data that allows us to look into every spectrum of Black male life and determine what our priorities should be and what we need, right? Let me see here. Let me catch up. Right. Okay. I'm still learning some of the lingo and I don't understand all of it. So bear with me. But I do want to extend a thanks to everybody out there for participating, for coming out, joining the chat. I'm going to be reading through them and I will get better at it. Again, Excuse my learning curve here. But at the end of the day, we will be able to do it. So next week, what's going to happen is I'll be on Interlight Radio next week, next Wednesday, 5 o'clock Pacific. I will be interviewing a colleague of mine who is going to lead us in a discussion about Black male happiness, what happiness actually means, and what that discussion can look like. So that'll be next week at 5 o'clock Pacific. That'll be live on Interlight Radio, and then afterwards I'll transfer and create the YouTube clip for that. So I'll post that next Wednesday, and it'll be the following Wednesday where I will do another live, and I may have a guest or two. It's kind of going organically for now. So again, bear with me. Any suggestions, you can go to my website at thassanjohnson.com and you can send an email through there. And I appreciate it. As you can see, this is very low level. This is very raw. I'm actually stepping off because I actually have to go cook my son dinner. But I just wanted to get the discussion I wanted to kind of lay out my logic and my approach to it. So that as we grow and continue to move on in the discussion, some things we can just point to and say, you can go back and check that episode for that information. So we will do it that way. So again, shout out to everybody that joined in the chat. I appreciate your time. You will hear from me next Wednesday. Also, go ahead and connect with me on Twitter and Facebook, and you'll get a lot more of this information that I post. So much appreciation to all of y'all for showing up. I'm going to end it a couple minutes early so I can go jump into this, and I will see you guys next week. Thanks.